Next, we have our second panel discussion, the reciprocal influence of Chinese and Western educational philosophies. Okay, this panel will be moderated by Professor Mina Xu-Min Jiang. Let me say a couple of words about her. Professor Jiang is Assistant Professor in Autism Spectral Disorder. She joined TC in 2010. Currently, she is the Program Coordinator of the program Intellectual Disability, Autism, and Autism in the Department of Health and Behavioral Sciences. Let's welcome Professor Jiang.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, introducing me. Okay, I'm very honored to be the moderator for this panel. In this panel, we have 3 scholars from Taiwan and 1 scholar from Boston. Okay, the first presenter is Mr. Yok-Lo Luo Yuanxu, Associate in Research at the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University and an investment management executive in Boston. His research interests include history of East-West relations since the 1800s and the role of Chinese Christian families played in these exchanges. The second presenter will be Professor Li Shuping, Associate Professor, National Central University. Her research interests include Chinese philosophy, Chinese character, culture, dictionary compilation, National Central University School History. The third presenter is Liu Weizhi, Assistant Professor, National Taiwan University, Normal University. Her research interests include history of the discipline of education, history of knowledge transfer between modern China and USA, history of knowledge transfer between modern China and Germany. The last presenter will be Professor Liang Yiping, Professor of English and American Studies, National Taiwan Normal University. Her research interests include Herman Melville, Asian American literature, Pacific Island studies, and multi-ethnic studies of the United States. Okay, each of them will present about 10 to 12 minutes. Okay, now let's welcome our first presenter, Mr. Yok-Lo Luo Yuanxu.
First of all, I would like to thank the Columbia Teachers College and China Institute and Carolyn and her family, who has been very nice to me, for inviting me to this forum. I have to first put a disclaimer. I am not an education theory expert. My interest is really in history. So I'm today receiving my education about education, if you will, so thank you, TC, for that. So now, oftentimes in Chinese, when we talk about education, there's a saying, 四年树木,百年树人, right? Oftentimes it's related to trees. It basically means, for those who don't speak Chinese, it takes 10 years to cultivate a tree, but it takes a century to cultivate mankind. So if you treat the legacy of, as we are celebrating 100 years of Guo Bingwen receiving his PhD from Columbia as a legacy, as a tree, so I'm going to focus on basically the roots of that tree, which is his family background and his educational background and the firms that his family is involved with. So here's a picture of Guo Bingwen is basically the third person from the right, and this is Guo Bingwen and his 2 brother-in-law, and basically with his brother-in-laws. So the key theme here is, they are all part of the Presbyterian Church, Jiang Lao Hui, and all went to a school called the Lowry Institute, which is Qingxin Shu Yuan, or Qingxin Zhongxue, which is now called Sinan Zhongxue in Shanghai, still a very well-known secondary school. And they are also, so they go to the church together, they're both all involved with the school, and also with commercial press, 商务印书馆. Especially a few of them the brother-in-law, the furthest one on the left, Xia Ruifang, C.F. Hao, very well known. I think there was a speech about a week ago that was delivered about Xia Ruifang. And he also became later also Guo Bingwen's father-in-law. And then the Bao brothers, the three Bao brothers. So they are all sons and son-in-law of Reverend Bao Jie-chai, who is the first Presbyterian, amongst the first Presbyterian Chinese minister. So they're the earliest converts, if you will, of the American Presbyterian Church. And what is special about them is is basically in terms of education, what the church has done. And Guo Bingwen himself has actually a very fair assessment of it, because there are certain American certain American people think that, okay, the missionaries really did a lot of work in China, and without them, there wouldn't be universities in China. And in Guo Bingwen, in the book that was compiled, you will see at the end there's an essay that Guo Bingwen wrote on when he was doing his lecture in Chicago about Christian education. And he think, well, they did a lot of work, that's correct, but it's not all because of the churches and the Christian, it's interesting that we are today in the chapel to talk about this. But certainly, they did a very important role in terms of promoting education, and the missionaries are really the first interaction Americans have with Chinese. So I want to talk about the schools and how these three things are really very much tied together in terms of the printing press, the church, in old Shanghai, basically all of these, the church, commercial press, and the school, Lowry School and Farnham School, were all in the same area. So next slide is basically a group picture at the wedding of Albino Sisip and Helen Bao. So this is taken from 1915, and you can see I have boxed in Guo Bingwen and his first wife, and also his second wife. So he actually married two different individuals from the commercial press family, second being Ruth. So 20 years after this picture is taken, he married Ruth Hao. And then there are several other members that I highlighted here. H.B. Yo, who's on the very, Yu Houpei, he has, everybody who studied Shangwu know about Zhang Yuanji, right? Zhang Yuanji has served there for many years. The second longest serving member would be H.B. Yo. H.B. Yo was essentially the chief technology officer of commercial press, and he worked there for 50 years. And then Zhang Shilin, I'll talk about him a little bit more. And then on PW's left, right-hand side, you have Y.C. Bao, who's the father of the bride, and he was a co-founder of Commercial Press, and V.D. Gao Fengchi, who also was one of the co-founder of Commercial Press, and is married to this family. So very close-knit family, and did a lot of work for China. So now I want to delve a little bit more into the Lowry School, Qingxin. Okay, so there's really two schools, both having the name Qingxin, pure heart. In English would be pure heart. So these were founded by the gentleman on the far left, Mr. John Farnham, Fan Yuehan, and his wife, Mary Farnham. So the school, Mary Farnham School, was named after his wife. So these two were really very prestigious schools in Shanghai. And Guo Bingwen himself basically spent his, that was the school that he went to. And he graduated from this school. At that time, I did some study because the Presbyterian Church has done a lot of work preserving their archive. And at that time when Guo Bingwen was there was only about 30 students there. It's a boarding school. It's not a very large school, but what is interesting about it is it's very different from most of the school at China at that time. It has a very well-rounded curriculum. Most people, when you think about Christian school, you may think, okay, it's probably trying to convert people to become Christians. So there will be Bible studies and all that. But the school is a lot more than that. So, for example, some of the textbooks that they have, which are all in English, in algebra, in geography, in physiology, in history, and elementary science. So there are lots of these material. And the Farnham School essentially also, Farnham School is one of the first girls' school in China. One of the first, among the first. And that girls' school basically essentially has exactly the same curriculum. So I think this really has an impact on Guo Bingwen later on in terms of the co-ed education element that a lot of the scholars have discussed about. Because he kind of, from the Presbyterian, the Lowry School and Farnham School, realize that it's important to educate both gender. And another thing that's very interesting about this school is that it has a focus on vocational education, vocational training. And this is rather interesting, and the story goes, during the Civil War, American Civil War, basically the funding was cut off for this church because the Americans were busy fighting amongst each other. And what happened was the church was running a very successful printing press called the American Presbyterian Mission Press, which is Meihua Shuguan, which was actually one of the largest publishing houses in China. And so basically, in order to support the school, a lot of the students started working in this printing press, including Guo Bingwen, his brother-in-laws, who all worked there. So the vocational aspect of this thing, even when the school became very wealthy later on, well, I wouldn't say very wealthy, but at least it was in good financial standing, they continue to have people who are interning, really learning about the skills of life, which is very important because if you think about traditional Chinese education, we're focusing on, I think one of the scholar mentioned, is focusing on how to become a government official. So this is kind of what differ. And I just want to point on one thing is the second gentleman, John Silsby. So we talk about Dewey and Monroe. Certainly they're very influential to Guo Bingwen. But the first person that he was his headmaster is John Silsby. And he also later on worked with John Silsby. After he returned from Columbia, he became the chairman of the Lowry Institute, P.W. Guo. And he wanted to upgrade it to a very high-level educational institute. So he worked with John Silsby as a teacher. So Guo Bingwen's first experience as a teacher was also right after he graduated from Lowry. So he was a teacher at Lowry, and then he went on. So the other graduates, other president, Zhang Shilin, who are his relative, Beulah Chang, those two also went to Columbia TC, just for your information, around the time. And Beulah was the headmistress of the Farnham School. And then to the right of Beulah is Samuel Wang, who is actually Carolyn's grand-uncle. So he actually ran this school also. So you can see the family is very involved. And I'm not going to read, in terms of the alumni that went to Farnham. So just want to quickly talk about commercial press in terms of its significance. In 1925, commercial press is responsible for 70%, 70, of textbook publishing in China. It also publishes 20 magazines. It also has a film division, movie division. So Guo Bingwen, he is actually very involved with commercial press. From 1918 until 1930s, he was a board member, along with people like Cai Yuanpei and Nang Qiqiao and a lot of very famous people. And he also wrote a number of books. He was not only as a director, he also involved with a number of books. For example, the most famous would be his PhD dissertation in Chinese. That was published in 1922 and on the left-hand side. And you can clearly see that he, is Jiangpu, that is his ancestral home. There's some dispute about whether that's really his ancestral home. He listed that as his ancestral. He was born in Shanghai, but he was really from Jiangpu, which is Pukao right now. And then on the right-hand side, you have one of the early success of commercial press is really the English text that it published. Because at that time, a lot of people, just like today, learning English is really the way to get ahead, to be exposed to the Western world. And commercial press did a lot of work in terms of translating these work, and this is an example of that work. And then another very important publication that P.W. Guo was involved with is, of course, being the editor of the first Chinese edition of the Webster Collegiate Dictionary. So in 1923, he was actually enlisted to help with this effort as the chief editor in 1917. And then in 1923, it was finally published. And you might be interested to know that there were many, many contributors, including Liu Boming, okay, who some of you who are from Dongnan Daxue would know. He was the deputy headmaster. Beiyan Li, who is, I'm going to talk a little bit about him later on. He is a relative of Guo Bingwen, and he was the president of Hangzhou Christian College. So he was a business expert. And then there's Jiang Monglin, which I think someone also mentioned. He's Columbia TC alumni, also classmate of PW. And he was an expert and later became the Beida president. He was also involved. So Guo Bingwen also later on was 1935. He really was a family production. Another dictionary called Practical Chinese English Dictionary. So there's several other members who were involved, and I'm going to highlight them later on. So the two, so aside from PW, there are really a good number of other Christian college presidents at that time. So Beiyan Li, I mentioned, who married a niece of Guo Bingwen. So he was the president of Hangzhou Christian College. And what is interesting is, in 1925, around that time, there was an anti-Christian education movement at that time in China. Some people think that the Christian schools are really kind of tools of the imperialists to influence, and there were a lot of student protests. And as a result of that, basically, Chinese were appointed president of these Christian colleges. Because before, it was basically, you have to be a Caucasian, American, or British to be president of those colleges. So Beiyan Li was taking advantage of that. And you can see that 1917, already a chemistry lab in Hangzhou. Right now it would be, people think about Alibaba as the center of innovation in Hangzhou. Back then, Hangzhou Christian College, a lot of science going on there. And then another guy is Y.G. Chen, who is Jingling Daxue. So he is also married to a cousin of Guo Bingwen's wife. And this university is very well known for its agricultural department. In fact, they also have a relationship with Cornell, and a lot of the people who are both involved in Taiwan and China agricultural reform, this university is really very involved. But I don't have enough time to really talk about it. The family tree of P.W. Guo and then all the educational institutions, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see that it's not just in China, it's actually, a lot of them came to the US, there are people in Hong Kong, Chinese University, a few of its predecessors has to do with Guo Bingwen. For example, his student was the head of New Asia College, Wu Jinsheng. Most people probably know about him from Dongnan. So and even to Philippines, the Asian Institute of Management, Washington Sisip, who is one of his grandnephew. So also another Columbia alumni. So you can see that the influence of the family is really very connected to education and continue to contribute to bettering the world. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, I want to make one correction. The second speaker is actually Liu Weizhi.
Good afternoon, Symposium Chairman, Professor Zheng, and all dear guests and colleagues from the United States, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. My report is based on dissertations done by Chinese graduates who obtained doctoral degrees at TC before 1950, and the faculty files of their advisors. The purpose of this report is to investigate what the 50 Chinese students learned, who they were advised by, and the characteristics these dissertations had as the first step towards the understanding of the impact of TC on China. First of all, I would like to talk about what did they learn and the characteristics of their dissertations at different time periods. The first time period is from 1910 to 1930. The first two dissertations by Chinese students were both on the topic of introducing the history of the Chinese educational system and philosophy. One of them is by Guo Bingwen. Dissertation in educational administration appeared in the middle of 1920s. Although the Chinese students were aware of the drastic differences of political system and cultural tradition between China and the US, they mapped out an educational administration system that is professional, decentralized, and adhere to the spirit of democracy based on the American blueprints. Educational psychology was the most popular area during the 1920s. About 50% of the dissertations done by Chinese students were in this area. These dissertations aim to use objective and efficient methods and tools, such as educational testing, to scientifically resolve the technical and practical educational issues in China. Overall, dissertations in all disciplines in the 1920s represented the positively naive attitude of learn and transplant. Some people even recommended to copy Western culture directly so as to instill modern characteristics of democracy, science, and individual subjectivity in China. As to the time period of between 1930 and 1950, the distribution of students in academic disciplines was as following. The top study area were in various teaching subjects and rural education. Secondary education ranked third. The three disciplines, educational administration, educational psychology, and educational philosophy, tied at the fourth ranking. There was a dramatic change in the content of dissertation in this time period when compared to those before. Most of these dissertations promoted society-centrism and emphasized nationalism. They insisted that it should be a cautious process to learn from foreign education system. They also criticized that the new education system promoted by earlier Chinese graduates of TC in the 1920s were like classroom exercises at TC. As to the question, who advised these Chinese students? First, the Thorndikean professors exercised the most strong influence on Chinese students. This is the first time period, and we can see the Thorndike is here. This both are from the same professor with Thorndike, and all the red names are Chinese students. Okay, based on these two diagrams, we could see that there were 22 Chinese students whose advisors had a Thorndykean background or shared the same advisor as Thorndike, which made the Thorndykean advisors accounted for 44% of all. Among them, Strayer, who was a professor for educational administration and whose advisor was Thorndike, here. He advised 6 Chinese students from 1914, starting from Guobingwen until 1944. He could be considered as the professor who advised most Chinese students in the first half of the 20th century. This is something people were not clear about in the past. To date, there still is misconception that all Chinese graduates must have been deeply influenced by Dewey, or the entire TC faculty was under the singular, strong, and sacred impact of Dewey's philosophy of education. In terms of Dewey's influence on Chinese students during the 1910 to 1920s, it was asserted through Dewey's impact on Kilpatrick, there was the Kilpatrick-Zhang Pengchun advisor relationship, although Kilpatrick's advisor was Monroe, not Dewey. After 1930, 2 of Kilpatrick's advisors, Childs and Raub, they are here, okay, continued to assert impacts on Chinese students, but actually, Kilpatrick or these social reconstructionists have more direct impact than Dewey and his theory. As for the Monroe Condo, this group, they ranked the third in terms of the number of 3 students they advised. In addition, Monroe also had clear impact on Guobingwen, and they formed a strong relationship. The above analysis is the first step towards understanding the impact of TC on the process of establishing Chinese education system, I have to thank Professor Steiner Kamsi, whose kind assistance allowed me to be a visiting scholar at TC during the summer of 2009. It gave me a chance to investigate relevant historical documentations. However, I have to mention that some part of this report were only inferences based on existing historical archive, and a lot of details still need to be verified through direct access to more archived information. For instance, the students' study records while they were attending the school. With this opportunity, I would like to recommend TC to consider relaxing the policy of the release of student records and information and adapt the policies of other schools like Cornell, Brown, Penn, Chicago, Stanford, that considered this kind of the records of former students who passed away for over 10 years or were born over 100 years ago as historical archive rather than personal information. In this way, it will help scholars clarify basic historical facts. This kind of practice is not against the FERPA spirit, that is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Because FERPA does not protect this privacy of this type of student record, there will be more factual information to support research so as to decrease the need for making inferences or speculation, and to allow for great breakthrough in research efforts. This will give the 100-year graduation anniversary of Guo Bingwen, and also the 100th anniversary of the exchange between TC and the Chinese education a considerable meaning. This was my report. Thank you very much for your listening.